Racist cop threatens black man. He's the state's attorney general. Have you ever witnessed a moment so charged with tension that the world seems to freeze, forcing you to stare injustice right in the face? Picture a calm evening in downtown Annapolis, Maryland, where centuries of history meet the bustle of modern government life. A tall, confident black man in a tailored suit steps onto the sidewalk to grab a quick coffee, unaware that a patrolling officer has already singled him out as suspicious. Within minutes, this seemingly routine encounter escalates into a tidal wave of hostility, accusations, and blatant racism. But in a twist that shocks everyone, the man being harassed isn't just any citizen. He's the Attorney General of Maryland, and the cop's life is about to turn upside down. The city of Annapolis wears its history proudly. Cobblestone streets wind around structures that have stood for centuries, while the grand Maryland State House, the oldest U.S. state capitol in continuous legislative use, anchors the skyline. On this balmy Tuesday evening, the city lights shimmered on the Severn River, painting a picturesque scene for tourists and locals alike. Not far from the State House stood a chic cafe, Amber and Oak Coffee House, known for its artisanal blends and cozy interior. Marcus Whitfield, the newly appointed Attorney General of Maryland, slipped into the cafe after wrapping up a marathon day of meetings. He craved a moment of normalcy, just a simple cup of coffee to remind him he was more than just the state's top law enforcement official. At 42, Marcus exuded a calm authority. Tall, with a lean build and an ever-present sense of poise, he wore his success lightly but confidently. Dressed in a crisp navy suit and polished shoes, he didn't exactly blend with the casual cafe crowd. Yet a warm smile from the barista, who recognized his face from the local news, made him feel at ease. "Long day, Mr. Whitfield?" she asked, handing him a small cappuccino. He chuckled. "In this job, every day's long, but I'm grateful to be here." A handful of customers cast curious glances. Some whispered to one another, realizing they were in the presence of the Attorney General. Marcus returned polite nods, then stepped back onto the sidewalk to head toward his car. He pressed the rim of the coffee cup to his lips, savoring the moment. His office was only a few blocks away, but he preferred the mild evening air to the hush of a chauffeured ride. A security detail usually accompanied him, but he had insisted on traveling alone for once. After all, Annapolis was his home, and he wanted to preserve a shred of independence. Little did he know, just around the corner, trouble lurked in the form of a patrol officer with a short fuse and a head full of biases. Marcus walked leisurely, letting the coffee's warmth counter the mild evening chill. The street lamp stretched his shadow across the sidewalk. He paused at a crosswalk, waiting for the light to change. Cars rolled by in an unhurried cadence. Without warning, he heard the squeak of brakes. A police cruiser pulled up to the curb, and an officer stepped out briskly. The name tag read Officer Dane McAllister. Stocky and broad-shouldered, McAllister wore a stern, almost suspicious expression. He zeroed in on Marcus like a hawk. "Hey, you!" he barked, hand lingering near his holstered weapon. "Come here!" Marcus turned, startled. "Me, officer!" McAllister narrowed his eyes. "Don't play dumb, ID, now." The abruptness of the command took Marcus aback. He glanced around. There was no one else on the immediate stretch of sidewalk. "Is there a problem?" Marcus asked, measuring his tone carefully. He knew from both personal experience and countless civil rights cases that an encounter like this could escalate rapidly. "I said, let me see some ID," McAllister repeated, more aggressively this time. "You match the description of a suspect reported in the area: tall, black male in a suit, carrying something suspicious." Marcus's pulse quickened, but his composure remained intact. "Carrying something suspicious? It's a cup of coffee." He held up the paper cup, forcing a polite smile. Officer, I believe there might be a misunderstanding. McAllister cut him off. Hands against the wall, he growled. Now, it was happening so fast. Marcus thought of the many times he'd read about these moments, how easily they spiral out of control. He considered revealing his position immediately, but a part of him bristled at the notion that he needed to declare his title just to be treated with basic respect. Also, he wanted to see exactly how far this officer would go. "Look, Officer McAllister," Marcus began, reading the name. "I'm just heading home. I haven't committed any crime. Can you at least tell me what's going on?" McAllister moved closer, jabbing a finger at Marcus's shoulder. "What's going on is I have reason to believe you're up to no good. So I'm telling you, put your hands on the wall, or I'll put them there for you." With tension coursing through his veins, Marcus placed his coffee on a nearby newspaper box, then calmly set both hands against the brick facade of a building. He could feel the cool texture under his palms. This was an indignity he never expected to experience on a quiet Annapolis street, least of all while holding the highest legal office in the state. That fact, ironically, was about to bring Officer McAllister's world crashing down. The pat-down began. McAllister's touch was neither gentle nor brief. It felt more like an attempt to intimidate than to search. Marcus fought back a surge of anger. A million thoughts crowded his mind. "I'm the Attorney General. This cop is harassing me. Where is his probable cause?" He'd already seen countless police misconduct complaints cross his desk. He'd championed new training initiatives to curb racial bias. Yet here he was, living out the exact scenario those reforms were meant to address. As if fate had more drama in store, a bystander approached. Christine Tan, an off-duty journalist from the local station WBAL-TV, had been picking up dinner nearby. She caught sight of the confrontation and began filming with her phone discreetly at first, but then more openly when she recognized the man in the suit. Her heart pounded. She'd interviewed Marcus Whitfield last month about a consumer protection case, and he'd been nothing but kind, thoughtful, and quietly determined. Now he was being searched like a criminal. Christine stepped closer. "Officer, is everything all right?" she asked calmly, though her phone was angled, recording. "I think this man is the—" She hesitated, uncertain whether to reveal Marcus's identity outright. She knew it would drastically alter the dynamic. McAllister whipped around, glaring at Christine. "Back off, lady," he snapped, jabbing the air with one hand. "This doesn't concern you. Move along." Christine's instincts told her to hold her ground. "Sir, I'm not interfering. I'm just— Are you refusing to comply?" McAllister snarled, his voice rising. "Because I can arrest you too." Christine's cheeks reddened. She glanced at Marcus, hoping for a cue. Marcus gave a subtle shake of his head, as if warning her not to escalate. He didn't want her to get caught in the crossfire. This was his predicament, and he had a right to handle it his way. Yet Christine couldn't remain silent. She stepped back slightly, but kept recording. She'd seen enough cases where footage made all the difference in holding reckless officers accountable. If McAllister was about to cross a line, it needed to be documented. McAllister continued his rough pat-down, pulling Marcus's wallet from his suit jacket. The officer flipped it open. If he was paying attention, he'd see the official ID labeling Marcus as Attorney General, State of Maryland. But it didn't register, perhaps because he was too busy fueling his own aggressive posture. "What's this?" McAllister demanded, pulling out a small official card. "Fake ID, huh?" Marcus exhaled. "If you read it, you'll see it's not fake." But McAllister gave it a quick glance and scoffed. "Attorney General? Don't make me laugh. You think I'm a fool?" He stuffed the wallet in his own pocket, ignoring the card's authenticity. "You're in big trouble, pal." Christine's camera captured every second. Viewers would later see the moment her phone shook as she realized the magnitude of what was unfolding. A racist cop, completely oblivious, ignoring the glaring truth that he was harassing the highest legal authority in the state. A second police cruiser appeared moments later, lights flashing but sirens silent. Officer Martha Delgado, a seasoned member of the Annapolis PD, stepped out. She'd heard McAllister's call for backup, possible suspect, refusing to comply. But as soon as she saw who McAllister had pinned against the wall, her eyes went wide. "Wait, is that?" Delgado began, voice shaking with recognition. She'd seen Marcus Whitfield multiple times at official functions. The department had even received a letter of commendation from the Attorney General's office after a successful drug bust last year. McAllister turned, mouth curling into a sneer. "Took you long enough, Delgado. I've got a suspicious character here." Delgado blinked, noticing Marcus's calm yet deeply offended expression. "Officer McAllister," she hissed under her breath. "That's Marcus Whitfield. He's the Attorney General of Maryland." A stunned silence. The tension hung thick. Christine's phone camera caught the flash of confusion on McAllister's face, then the flicker of dread. He jerked Marcus's wallet from his pocket again, scanning the identification more carefully this time. There it was, in official gold lettering. Marcus Whitfield, Attorney General, State of Maryland. Slowly, McAllister's face drained of color. His swaggering stance faltered. He stammered. "Sir," one didn't realize. Marcus turned around, standing tall. "Yes, officer. It appears you didn't." He kept his voice measured, though a tremor of anger coursed within him. He snatched his wallet from McAllister's shaky hands and placed it back in his suit jacket. "You had plenty of opportunity to check it properly. Instead, you chose to treat me like a criminal." Officer Delgado shot McAllister a fiery glare, stepping forward. "Sir, one, apologize on behalf of the Annapolis Police Department. This is a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding?" Christine Tan's voice chimed in, incredulous. He was being harassed for no reason. The officer wouldn't even read his ID. "I have it all on video." Delgado's shoulders sagged. She wasn't sure how to salvage the situation. Her gaze flicked to Marcus, who radiated quiet fury. He was, after all, the highest law enforcement official in Maryland. He had the power to launch investigations that could shake the entire department. McAllister opened his mouth, then closed it again. The magnitude of his blunder was sinking in, but he still harbored that stubborn pride. He tried to muster some defense. "We had a report of suspicious activity. A tall male in a suit said he might be carrying a weapon." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "A weapon or a coffee cup?" His voice was sharper now. "Officer, did you have any real probable cause? Or did you simply see me a black man in a suit and decide that alone was suspicious?" McAllister glanced around, searching for support, but none came. He was alone in his prejudice, and the entire scenario was unraveling before the watchful eyes of his fellow officer, a local reporter, and the actual Attorney General. The next blow would soon land, and there'd be no recovering from it. The rest of the evening passed in a swirl of phone calls, apologies, and uneasy attempts at damage control by the Annapolis PD. Marcus, after providing a brief statement, left the scene quietly. He refused a police escort, ignoring McAllister's stammered attempts to placate him. Christine Tan's footage, however, was about to ignite a firestorm. She hurried back to the WBAL-TV studio in Baltimore, where her editor nearly fell out of his chair watching the clip. "This is bigger than local news," he muttered, eyes wide. The Attorney General was racially profiled by a cop in broad daylight. They wasted no time preparing the segment for the evening broadcast. Racial profiling in Annapolis. State's Attorney General mistaken for suspect. The headline scrolled across the screen as Christine narrated the story. While they balanced the coverage, noting that the Annapolis Police Department had apologized, They didn't shy away from showcasing McAllister's aggression. Social media lit up like a thunderbolt. Within hours, hashtags like #JusticeForag and #Maryland Cop Scandal trended regionally. Activists, politicians, and citizens weighed in. Some expressed shock that even the state's most powerful black official wasn't immune to profiling. Others demanded immediate disciplinary action against McAllister. Late that night, Marcus sat in his home office, phone buzzing endlessly with calls, texts, and emails. His communications director had left urgent voicemails. Staffers from the governor's office reached out too, offering support or advice. He rubbed his temples, eyes strained from reading the deluge of messages. He felt deeply conflicted. Part of him just wanted to move past it. He had major cases pending, from environmental enforcement to consumer fraud. He didn't need a personal fiasco overshadowing his agenda, but he also couldn't ignore the injustice he'd experienced. This was bigger than him. If an attorney general could be treated so callously, what about every other black man or woman walking these same streets? A beep signaled an incoming call. Governor Rebecca Warren. Marcus hesitated, then answered. "Madam Governor," he said, forcing composure. Her voice bristled with concern. "Marcus, I saw the news." "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," he replied, though the memory of the officer's rough hands still made his skin crawl. "I appreciate your concern. This is unacceptable," the governor said, anger evident. "I intend to speak with the Annapolis chief of police personally. This sort of behavior cannot stand, especially from an officer who obviously let prejudice guide his actions." Marcus exhaled, scanning his reflection in a nearby mirror. The lines of the day's stress were etched across his features. "I'm considering next steps," he said carefully. "We have protocols, and I want to ensure everything is done correctly." Governor Warren's tone softened. "I trust your judgment. The entire state is behind you. Let me know what you need." They ended the call, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts. He glanced at the cappuccino cup, still on his desk, half finished hours ago, now cold. That simple beverage had become a symbol of the evening's events, an innocent gesture that turned into a fiasco. He resolved then that he would not let this slip by. Real accountability was needed, not just for him, but for every citizen in Maryland. By midday the next day, the Annapolis Police Department's Internal Affairs Division had launched an investigation into Officer Dane McAllister's actions. The department's public relations officer released a statement promising a thorough review and appropriate disciplinary measures if wrongdoing is confirmed. But the public had already seen the video. They didn't need an investigation to see wrongdoing. Protesters gathered outside the police station, brandishing signs that read, "Not even the AG is safe and end racial profiling now." A local black pastors coalition announced a prayer vigil. City council members demanded immediate suspension of McAllister, while the local FOP, Fraternal Order of Police, insisted on due process. Meanwhile, Christine Tan found herself inundated with interview requests from CNN to the New York Times. Everyone wanted to talk to the reporter who filmed the fiasco. She agreed to a few appearances, carefully choosing her words. She'd known Marcus Whitfield in a professional capacity, and while she maintained objectivity, her voice trembled slightly each time she recalled the officer's hostility. Officer McAllister, for his part, was placed on administrative leave pending the IA review. He hunkered down in his modest row house on the outskirts of Annapolis, phone turned off, blinds drawn. Reporters knocked, neighbors whispered. He felt trapped. Initially, he'd tried to rationalize his actions, claiming he was just doing his job. But deep down, a seed of guilt gnawed at him. Every so often, he'd see the news broadcast replay that humiliating scene, him forcibly patting down the state's top legal official while ignoring clear ID. He had no defense, only a feeble claim that someone matching the description had been reported. Even that was starting to look like a fabrication. No official call log showed anything about a suspect in a suit carrying a weapon. For the Annapolis PD's leadership, the entire affair was a nightmare. Chief Anthony Delgado, no relation to Officer Martha Delgado, called an emergency press conference. Flanked by the department's deputy chiefs, he stood at a podium beneath the bright midday sun. "We take these allegations very seriously," the chief stated solemnly. "No one is above the law, nor should anyone be subjected to unlawful detention. We are committed to fairness, transparency, and accountability. The investigation is ongoing." Questions flew from the press corps. Is McAllister a known racist? How often does this happen to people without such a high profile? The chief tried to maintain composure, but the subtext was clear. If a cop can do this to the Attorney General, how many everyday citizens have been harassed in the same manner? Marcus arrived at the State House for a scheduled meeting with legislative leaders about upcoming bills, consumer protection, environmental lawsuits, and, ironically, a measure on police reform that he'd championed. Stepping through the grand entrance, he was greeted by a swarm of camera flashes and shouted questions. Security ushered him in quickly. Inside, he took a moment to compose himself, leaning against a marble pillar. This was new territory. He was used to defending others in court, not being the one in the public spotlight for victimization. Even lawmakers he'd known for years approached him with wide-eyed concern, offering condolences as if he'd suffered a tragedy. The lines of sympathy blurred with political opportunism, though. Some sensed a moment to push broader reforms, using Marcus's ordeal as a galvanizing force. He was prepared to address the issue in a press statement that afternoon. As he sifted through talking points with his communications director, a call came in from his mother, Linda Whitfield, who lived in Baltimore. He excused himself from the meeting and stepped into a quiet hallway. "Marcus, honey, I saw the video," she said, voice trembling with a blend of worry and indignation. "Are you okay?" Hearing the concern in his mother's voice brought the events back to a human level. "I'm fine, Mom," he said softly. "Just a little shaken." She sighed. "I always told you to be careful, but never did I think my son, the Attorney General, singled out just for being a black man on the street. Promise me you'll use this for good. I know it must hurt, but you have the power to make change." Her words resonated deeply. Marcus recalled how, as a child, she'd lectured him on how to act during police encounters, hands visible, voice steady, no sudden moves. Now, decades later, the lesson was still painfully relevant, even though he was the top law enforcement official in the state. "I promise, Mom," he said. "I won't let this go." They hung up, and he returned to the meeting. That day, a quiet determination took root in Marcus's mind. He realized he'd served justice not just for himself, but for countless other citizens who faced similar or worse encounters without the privilege of an official title. "This is my duty," he thought. "I can't walk away." The first step was filing a formal complaint with the Annapolis PD's Internal Affairs. Marcus knew how to navigate that process better than most. Typically, attorneys general don't file personal police complaints, but in this case, it was the right move. He wanted to ensure the matter followed standard procedure, no special treatment, no sweeping it under the rug. The moment he finished signing the documents, a swirl of media coverage followed. Some critics accused him of using his position to scapegoat an officer. Others lauded him for shining a light on systemic biases in policing. Simultaneously, Marcus conferred with the governor's office about launching an independent investigation. While internal affairs was standard, an independent review could bring extra credibility. The idea of an outside commission examining not just McAllister's actions, but the broader culture that allowed it was appealing. There's a bigger picture here, Marcus reminded himself. One officer is not the entire problem, but holding him accountable is a start. Then there was the question of civil action. Multiple civil rights attorneys approached him, offering to file suit on his behalf. It felt strange. He was used to being on the other side, representing the state in court. Ultimately, Marcus decided not to pursue personal damages. Instead, he wanted to push for mandatory anti-bias training, better oversight, and stronger community engagement. "You're giving up a potential settlement," Sam Ryan, a prominent civil rights lawyer, told him over a phone call. "But I respect your choice, Marcus. Sometimes real change goes beyond money." Marcus nodded, even though Sam couldn't see him. "Exactly," he said. "Let's see if we can direct that energy towards structural reform." Meanwhile, protests continued outside Annapolis PD, forming a broad-based coalition of activists, students from local colleges and concerned residents. They chanted slogans demanding McAllister's firing and better police accountability. The image of a determined crowd holding signs reading "Attorney General or not, racial profiling must stop" filled the local TV screens each night. Holed up in his modest living room, Officer Dane McAllister watched the news coverage with a mounting sense of dread. Every broadcast slammed his actions as blatant racial profiling. The footage from Christine Tan's phone had gone viral, attracting commentary from national civil rights organizations. His phone remained silent, no calls of support from colleagues. A handful of friends texted him half-hearted lines like, "Hang in there," but the department had turned its back on him. He had become a PR nightmare. The union rep visited once, cautioning him to remain quiet, to avoid interviews, and to let the process unfold. "Do you realize who you manhandled?" the rep had asked with undisguised exasperation. "I mean, of all people, the state's Attorney General." McAllister's pride flared. "I didn't know it was him," he muttered defensively. "He was suspicious. I was following procedure." "Really?" "Because it doesn't look that way," the union rep replied, pained. "We can't fix this if the evidence is stacked against you." As the days passed, McAllister descended deeper into a mire of self-pity and anger, combing over the video again, seeing how he'd jumped to conclusions, how he'd refused to read the ID. Whether he could admit it or not, it was racism, plain and simple, that had guided his actions. He might have convinced himself otherwise in the moment, but the entire state now saw the truth. Then came the dreaded letter from Internal Affairs, scheduling a formal hearing. If they found him guilty of misconduct, the best he could hope for was termination. The worst might be criminal charges, especially if the AG's office pursued that route. In a desperate attempt to save himself, McAllister contacted a local attorney, who advised him to show contrition and emphasize any miscommunication. But McAllister was hardly adept at contrition. He stewed in resentment, a potent mix of shame and fury. Night after night, he paced his living room, shadowed by regrets that nothing could erase. Annapolis City Hall bustled with activity on the day of the police oversight hearing. Journalists, civic leaders, and everyday citizens crowded the main chamber, eager to witness what might be a historic moment in local law enforcement accountability. Rows of wooden seats filled quickly, leaving some people standing against the back wall. At the front sat a panel from the city's Civilian Review Board, formed to evaluate officer misconduct. Officer McAllister sat at a table, flanked by a grim-faced union attorney. A hush settled as the door opened, and Marcus Whitfield entered. Heads turned, cameras flashed. The Attorney General's arrival lent a gravity that made McAllister visibly squirm. The panel chair cleared his throat. "We'll begin with opening statements. Officer McAllister, you have the floor." The union attorney spoke, detailing a narrative that tried to paint the incident as unfortunate confusion. He claimed Officer McAllister received a vague call about a suspicious man possibly carrying a firearm, that McAllister had limited time to verify IDs, and that the suspect turned out to be the AG by pure coincidence. A rumble of discontent rolled through the audience. The story contradicted official dispatch logs, which showed no call about a weapon. Next, the attorney read a reluctant apology from McAllister, who insisted he never intended racial bias. The words rang hollow, especially compared to Christine Tan's footage. Then it was Marcus's turn. The chair recognized him with a respectful nod. Marcus rose, stepping before the microphone. Although he was intimately familiar with courtrooms, this setting felt different. He was a victim here, not the state's counsel. Members of the review board, he began, voice steady. I stand before you not just as the Attorney General, but as a black man who was singled out for no other reason than my appearance. Officer McAllister did not run my ID. He ignored my attempts to clarify who I was. He used forceful language and intimidation. He paused, letting the gravity sink in. This is not about me alone. It's about systemic issues. If the state's top legal officer can be treated this way, what happens to those without titles or influence? My hope is that this hearing leads to true accountability and ensures that no one, regardless of race or status, is subjected to such discrimination again. Applause broke out. Though the chair tried to maintain decorum, Marcus stepped back, heart pounding. He'd laid the truth bare, careful not to transform it into a personal vendetta. This was about principle. The hearing continued with testimony from Christine Tan, who played her video footage once more. Next came Officer Delgado's statement, corroborating how McAllister disregarded clear evidence of Marcus's identity. By the end of the day, it was painfully evident to everyone in the room that McAllister had no valid defense. The panel deliberated briefly, some might say too briefly, but the evidence was overwhelming. They returned with their recommendation: Officer McAllister be terminated from the Annapolis Police Department for gross misconduct and racial bias. Additional notes suggested the district attorney could investigate potential civil rights violations. The room erupted in hushed murmurs. McAllister sat stone-faced, absorbing the blow that he'd likely never serve in law enforcement again. The union attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, but McAllister shrugged it off. His gaze flicked across the audience, landing on Marcus. For a split second, the two men locked eyes, one filled with righteous resolve, the other with wounded pride. Outside, reporters pressed for comments. The Attorney General gave a brief statement, emphasizing that while the decision was a step in the right direction, there remained a broader need for institutional reform. Let this be a wake-up call, he said, voice echoing against the marble columns of City Hall. Racism in policing must end, and we all share that responsibility. McAllister pushed past the crowd, refusing to speak. Cameras tracked him to his car, where he slammed the door and sped off. Social media exploded with reactions, some praising the outcome, others lamenting the state of policing. But the prevailing sentiment was relief that accountability had been served. That evening, local news stations replayed the moment the panel handed down its decision. Some anchors framed it as a pivotal event in Maryland's ongoing effort to reform policing. Indeed, the case sparked widespread discussions about standard procedures, training, and how to handle implicit bias within police ranks. Marcus Whitfield, meanwhile, felt both relief and a strange numbness. He'd won a personal victory, but at the cost of a harsh national spotlight on his private humiliation. More importantly, he'd forced a conversation. And as the days wore on, more citizens stepped forward with their own stories of being stopped, questioned, or harassed for fitting a description. The ripple effect was unstoppable. In the weeks following the hearing, the Annapolis PD instituted new mandatory de-escalation and anti-bias training sessions for all officers. The department's leadership appeared at community forums, listening to residents' grievances and concerns. Rebuilding trust was an uphill climb, but the commitment felt genuine. The governor's independent commission also launched an investigation into policing practices, focusing on how calls for service are handled and whether race influences how officers approach suspects. The commission's interim report recommended more stringent oversight, body camera usage, and improved community-based policing strategies. Meanwhile, Marcus continued his duties as Attorney General with renewed fervor. His personal ordeal became a rallying cry for broad reforms. When he traveled across the state, local leaders often invited him to speak about police accountability. He approached these invitations with sincerity, determined to keep the focus on the bigger picture rather than his single experience. One evening, he returned home late to find a letter in his mailbox with an unfamiliar return address. Inside, a simple note read, "Mr. Whitfield, I can't change what I did, but I'm sorry, dear McAllister." Marcus stared at the note, emotions swirling. He couldn't be sure if this was genuine remorse or a last-ditch effort to salvage what was left of McAllister's reputation. Either way, it signaled a shift from hostility to acknowledgement. He tucked the letter away, uncertain how to respond. Perhaps forgiveness was possible down the road, but only after real change took root. Months later, Annapolis had steadied itself from the media whirlwind. The event that once dominated headlines was now a case study in law schools and police academies, illustrating how bias can overshadow duty. The name Marcus Whitfield evoked both the dignity of an attorney general and the resilience of a citizen who faced injustice head-on. One chilly morning, Marcus walked again through downtown Annapolis, passing by the same corner where he'd been stopped. The bricks glowed under the early sunlight, and the cafe across the street beckoned with its aroma of freshly brewed coffee. This time, no police cruiser swerved to intercept him. Passers-by recognized him, some offered quick greetings or words of support. He paused, inhaling the crisp air. A sense of resolve filled him. He'd endured a harrowing experience, but in that confrontation, a doorway to progress had opened. Maryland was already seeing shifts in policing policy, and the broader conversation about racial justice had found fresh momentum. Marcus entered Amber and Oak Coffee House once more, stepping in line behind a young college student. The barista, remembering him, offered a welcoming smile. "Good morning, Mr. Whitfield. Your usual cappuccino?" He nodded, placing his order. As he waited, he couldn't help but reflect on how a moment of blatant racism had catalyzed a wave of change. Sometimes the law is shaped in courtrooms, other times it's shaped on the streets, in everyday encounters that force society to confront its biases. Moments later, cappuccino in hand, Marcus stepped out into the day. The horizon felt a bit brighter, the path a bit clearer. There was still much to do, countless reforms, lawsuits, and legislative battles ahead. But in that instance, he allowed himself to savor a small victory. Justice had been served, a wrong had been righted, and an opening for deeper transformation lay within reach. He took a sip, letting the warmth wash over him. This was how progress began, one bold stand at a time. Thank you for joining us on this powerful journey of confrontation, courage, and overdue justice. When Attorney General Marcus Whitfield was profiled by a single biased officer, it ignited a storm that laid bare the unsettling truth. Racial discrimination can strike even the highest levels of power. Yet, this story also proves the resilience of those who refuse to be silenced. Through public outrage, unwavering advocacy, and legal accountability, real change took root in Annapolis and stood as a beacon of hope for communities everywhere. If this story stirred your sense of justice or opened your eyes to the urgent need for systemic reform, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support fuels more stories that spotlight the fight against inequality, demand accountability, and celebrate the triumph of truth. Let's stand together for fairness, dignity, and the principle that no one is ever above or beneath the law. Thank you for watching.